But yeah, before diving into it, thank you so much, Joe, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So who doesn't know Joe here? Anyone need a quick background? Okay, I guess I'll save the background. So I guess I wanted to kind of jump in and kind of like call out the elephant in the room, which is that I think as of recent years, a lot of these NAF kind of like thematic markets and industries are generally confined by politically kind of like conservative investors and founders. And I think as of late, that has been changing a little bit. I'm curious to get your take on why you think that is.
Interesting. And so, I guess Silicon Valley really started based on a lot of defense and aerospace stuff. And I don't think it was partisan at all then, right? I think the first really big company that created Silicon Valley in a lot of ways was Hewlett-Packard. And Hewlett-Packard's early growth in the late 30s and early 40s was like specifically defense stuff, right? All the electronic stuff in defense. And you had a lot of other, obviously Lockheed and Martin and all sorts of other big defense things here. And I think you went into a period, first of all, where it was just, I think the bigger thing was it was just like no one was doing it for 30 years. So I think that's actually the bigger elephant in the room is Silicon Valley had been the leaders in defense and there's just no one was doing it at all. And it was partially because it became really, really hard to compete with the primes. And the primes are like the 6 biggest defense companies, and they I don't know exact percent, but they take the vast majority of the revenue for these 6 big companies, and they all have like hundreds of people in DC meeting Congress. They all have tons of people who used to run the DoD coming out to run them back and forth, and in their defense, they were the best in the world at certain areas. But if you want to be as good at someone as building these certain types of planes or creating these certain types of like nuclear missiles, you can't just do that as a startup out of, I love SPC, but you're probably not going to be figuring out new nuclear missiles to test here, right? It's just hard to do if you're not already a prime, been doing it for 30 years. And so there's all these natural moats that they had. And I think a few of us kind of saw that they were really decaying in a very worrying way. Maybe starting, especially, I think the biggest gap you started to see Silicon Valley really pull ahead of the rest of the world, and like what we learned about building software from the bubble in the late 90s, and all the top talent came to Silicon Valley from all over the world. And so you had all these huge advances happened here, 20 to 25 years ago. And then we were kind of watching after 9/11 how the US was reacting and doing things in software the same way they had 20 or 30 years before, and we were horrified, right? And so I think a lot of us said, wow, it's like a patriotic duty, it's a mission to help defense. And I guess you could argue that was more naturally something that people who are biased towards patriotism, biased towards kind of love of country would be doing. I tend to think, when we started Palantir, it wasn't like it was a bunch of Republicans. I think we're probably more Democrats than there were Republicans on the team at Palantir early on, but they were probably moderate Democrats. So in a sense, it wasn't like it was like a politically oriented thing, but you did have people who really did want to like fight for the U.S. and fight for our allies as part of it. And I tend to think the reason that Palantir and Anduril and these companies are controversial is more tied to like, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's more tied to the dynamic in our society that's very polarized today, where you have extreme voices on the left and the right, kind of shaping the dialogue, right? So I'll so that everyone doesn't hate me who's on the left. On the far right, it's a huge problem today too. I live in Texas. We have a crazy AG, and he literally wants to go relitigate Lawrence versus Texas, which was the thing that allowed, overturn Texas's sodomy laws. The Supreme Court said you can't ban sodomy anymore. And he's like, oh, we should overturn that now. We've done Roe versus Wade. And I'm like, this guy's crazy, right? So there's crazy guys on the right we're dealing with, and there's crazy people on the left we're dealing with who want to rewrite all of America's history as bad, and everything America does is evil, and you can't fight for America in any way, or you're a bad person. And those people are probably 5% of Google, and they stop Google from doing things in defense. And I think they're crazy too. So I think there's these extremists I disagree with. And I think there's like a lot of moderates who want America to, even though it's not perfect, it's a force for good, and we don't want it to be weaker than our enemies.
Fair enough. It's actually interesting you bring up patriotism, and I figured like the answer would kind of go in that path. But I think like you said, Palantir and Anduril are actually the companies that I kind of had in mind. Where I think if you think about like the Lockheeds of the world, and you read maybe like Skunkworks, the memoir talking about Lockheed during the Cold War, it used to be considered like very, very patriotic to be like working at these companies, right? Like the smartest people would be going to like build rockets and build fighter pilots. But now it seems like the new kind of companies that you'd think are analogs to that might actually be these defense companies like Anduril or Palantir or
Epirus. And we still get like tons of patriots coming there for that reason, right?
Got it. So is your point more that these like kind of like loud people that are screaming about patriotism. That's actually like a very like vocal minority.
I
but-
think it's a vocal minority that wants to overturn the sodomy laws in Texas, and I think it's a vocal minority that wants to say that America's evil, we shouldn't help it. Now, unfortunately, the vocal minority on the left probably has a lot of influence in our universities and a lot of influence in our big tech companies and a lot of influence in our media. And so if you just look to the big tech companies in the media, you'll say, yes, these are very controversial companies. Whereas if you just actually talk to normal people and discuss what they're doing and map it out, I don't actually think they're that controversial. I think it's something that's influenced by this polarized noise in our society, is my view.
Fair enough.
I'm happy to discuss in detail if people think there's controversies there that they've heard and kind of the reasonable perspective on it, because it's fun to talk about. So if you guys are like, oh, well, what about this thing you guys are doing? Let's have that conversation after if you want.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I think if there are questions that come up, I'm happy to field them. As they come up as well, if it's like more thematic. I guess like jumping off of my first question a little bit still, where it does feel like, I think Palmer Luckey talked about it in the All In Summit recently, where I think like Anduril is getting a little more acceptance kind of like writ large. And I think a lot of that is because there are kind of these tensions, like the Russia-Ukraine conflict and tensions with China that are making...
oh yeah, people see that when the world's a dangerous place, you don't want America to be totally incompetent. Right. So it's actually terrifying how incompetent some of the DoD stuff has gotten. Yep. And how far behind we are in terms of, we track top technologists, top computer scientists for a lot of my work as an investor and entrepreneur. And pretty much almost none of the top computer scientists have gone to the legacy primes and to the DoD over the last, decade or two. And the ones that do tend to leave very quickly because they don't want to be part of those cultures. And so this to me is a crisis for our country if we actually want to make sure we're not falling behind China and Iran and Russia in different areas. So I think people see what's going on in the world, and when the world gets to be a more dangerous place, they get to have more common sense. Okay, yeah, we want to make sure we're being competent here,
But I guess by definition, when people are reacting to current events that are happening, you're generally kind of like lagging, right?
Yeah.
Palmer Luckey makes the point that you don't really build in defense to fight or win wars. You actually build in defense to deter those wars.
You fight in defense to deter wars. That's correct.
Yeah. So by definition,
or an intelligence to take out the bad guys and stop attacks.
Fair enough. Yeah. Exactly. But by definition, like if people are kind of like chasing current events, then it feels like there's always a lag. Do you think like even kind of like the more optimism that we see now is kind of like a long-term trend, or do you think it's going to be again kind of a fad, and once it's vanquished, we're...
I'd go back to I think the more core thing that's happening. I think it's a fair question, but that's almost like I think almost no matter what, if you're asking what the masses are going to do, they're going to react in fads and they're going to go back and forth. If you're asking what's the underlying trend here, a very promising trend in the last decade is a lot of the people running the DoD, a lot of the generals, are realizing how much the primes have fallen down and fallen on their faces. And like even when we were building Palantir early on, you'd go in and the FBI had just spent like $700 million on a virtual case file system that they completely threw out, like total mess that a few of the integrators had done. And so even back then you were seeing all these failures, all these giant software boondoggles that you pay cost plus for software and it costs $1 billion and you get nothing. Big surprise, right? We all know that's not how software is supposed to be built. But it's actually gotten to the point where it's even more extreme, where they're very frustrated with the primes. They know there's a problem. They know the innovation hasn't worked the way it's supposed to, and so they're more open to outsiders, thanks to Palantir, thanks to SpaceX, obviously, like outperforming the aerospace guys, and then now thanks to Anduril, Epirus, other ones we're doing. The trick is that we've convinced them to allow there to be competition, so to allow there to be something where we're allowed to come in and compete, where you've defined who's the winner. Because whenever they let us compete, we crush the legacy primes these days on a bunch of areas. But when they don't let us compete, we're always going to lose because we're not going to know how to play the RFP relationship game nearly as well as those guys.
Got it. And I think that actually kind of takes us to our next question, which is that you've obviously built a bunch of companies in the intersection of defense and government, namely like Palantir, Epirus, OpenGov. And all of these have been able to successfully kind of like crack this go-to-market motion, right? You've been actually able to sell and kind of like work.
Yeah, we didn't figure it out right away.
Right. So
had to go through like years of stupid mistakes and barely surviving. But yes, at least for Palantir and OpenGov, but we figured it out eventually.
Right. So, and I think like a big reason kind of like we're having this speaker series is to kind of like get potential founders in this area like more knowledgeable about these spaces. So I guess the question here is like, what advice do you have for founders who are looking to sell to government? And I guess the follow-up is, if you're building a new company in defense or government, where are you looking to start something?
So GovTech is very, very hard. You only want to do GovTech if you're just like, first of all, it's like you're obsessed with this problem, you really want to solve this problem, and you have a solution that's like in some ways 10 times better than what they're already doing. You can't just do GovTech and have something that's like moderately better or that's like competing with what's already out there but is similar. It almost never works. You have to find something the government's doing that is so excruciatingly stupid that you just like can't help yourself, and you have to get some smart friends and go fix this problem because it's so obvious, and everyone who's being honest knows what you're doing is better. So I think that's like the first step. And then the second step is governments almost never create new budgets for things. So what does that mean? Like, does that mean they can't do anything new? No, they could do things that are new, but you have to find an existing process that they already have a budget to like fix that, to like run that process. Then you have to go compete against that existing budget and steal away what's there. And the problem with government is you got to be really patient sometimes, because sometimes they do these things over 5 or 7 year time horizons. So ideally you have enough customers that you can kind of go to some of them that are coming due and prove it out, improve it for the next one, et cetera. So it's very, very hard. Even the best GovTech companies on average don't grow very quickly. There's exceptions in defense, but
Sure.
the most, like OpenGov is a great company. It's doing very well in that space, and it's like growing in the mid-20s is like equivalent of growing in the 50 percentile for some other things, you know. And then I guess one other thing I'll say, because I can give you a much longer list, but
Sure.
another thing for GovTech is the governments it's like a funny dialectic where they're extremely risk averse. Like none of these bureaucrats, like you're gonna have your job forever and your pension, you're fine as long as you don't do anything crazy and stupid. You're never gonna get fired for buying the legacy thing or the IBM thing or the kind of mediocre thing. So very, very risk averse. But what's happening now is there's a generational turnover. These stuff they've been doing for 30 years with these black and white screens or black and green screens, and they're very kind of linear, don't really allow them to use data. The young generation comes in, they realize something's wrong here, and they love the idea of being innovative. So it's a funny dialogue. They're risk averse, but they really want to be innovators. And so what does that mean? It means you have to basically have to like hack your first few customers, because it's really hard. You have to have some special relationship. You have to give it to them for cheap or whatever. Just really figure out. And once you have a few in and you can prove that it's already being used, it's then safe enough for the person who's really risk averse, wants to be innovative to do it. So it's very chicken and egg. It's very hard to get those first 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 going because most government people don't want to do something new.
Got it. And I think part of that, it seems like, although there is like a lot of inflow of venture capital into these sorts of businesses now, because I do think,
it's still actually rather small because it's a tough market.
Right.
It's a tough market.
But I guess like it doesn't really matter how much venture capital goes into this, as long as I guess the higher order bit is actually getting these products that are being built into the hands of the end users. Correct?
Getting the revenue to actually make these things sustainable businesses is very difficult.
So what's kind of, so I think OpenGov might be a good case study here, but what's kind of the unlock that you saw that actually like helped you work better with the government, or like kind of get in those 1 to 2, 3?
So OpenGov, depending how you measure it, it's in well over 1,000 cities and state agencies, and we have about 27 processes we run for them, which sounds like a lot, but I think there's actually probably about 95 to 100 processes that a city runs in software they pay for these days, like different types of licensing, different types of permitting, different types of, like one of my things I'm most proud of is our cloud-based budgeting software, where you can actually work on the budget together in the cloud and collaborate and stuff, versus these guys coming in with spreadsheets and and stuff. And I guess the unlock there was just realizing we had to. I mean, it sounds obvious, but realizing we had to identify existing budget and existing process. So rather than just like, I'll give you guys the background on OpenGov. So my friends and I already started Palantir and Addepar, and I was started a nonprofit with like 20 Stanford kids. And the idea was to like map out all of California spending and figure out where it's efficient, where it's not. My bias was that California seemed to be wasting a lot of money. This was like 12 years ago. And we built all these regressions where you kind of can measure about how much a state should be spending based on regressing a bunch of factors. And we put it all online. We have California, a bunch of other states. And it was pretty cool because it showed some of California's departments were actually about right on the regression, right what you'd expect. And other ones were oftentimes spending 50%, 80% more than the regression. And wherever there was that 50% plus more, it was always where there was really strong special interest. Like California has the best paid prison guards in the world. It has lots of very strong union special interests. So it was kind of fun. And we put it up online, and there was like 1,000 media articles attacking these poor kids because I didn't put my name on it. It was just all the Stanford kids because I thought it'd be more fun for them to get attacked for it, because I get attacked enough, as you guys know, as it is, even back then. So there are all these articles attacking them, and all these cities started writing them and saying, "Can you do this for us too? Can you do this for our data? Analyze our spend." And we're like, "This is cool. Can you send the data over?" And the city manager would be like, "How do I send the data?" And we're like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "Don't you have systems?" And he's like, "Oh, the the consultant is saying it costs $50,000 to get this data to give it to me to send to you. And we're like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And we looked into it, and there's like, 90,000 municipalities, but 30,000 big municipalities in the US that matter. And they're all running off these systems that were mostly like black and white, black and green screens. And a lot of them had these consultants where you just had to pay them a lot of money to even see your data, to compare what you're spending, to understand what's going on. Like, this is horrifying. And I had this theme starting about 2010 or so with the cloud, that we were going to go and replace all these old on-premise systems. And kind of basically what happened, if you go back in Silicon Valley, there was a ton of enterprise software sold in the 60s and 70s and 80s that was funded in order to sell computers. And it was like the very first basic enterprise software. And this stuff's very linear, right? Very good at going from A to B to C, doing your basic workflows, very bad at incorporating data. And so now that we have the mobile ecosystem and big data and the cloud, all of a sudden there's a need to like use data in more dynamic ways, to compare things, to build models. And the old stuff can't do any of that. So there's this big theme in the economy where there's all this stuff starting about 10 years ago. They went and replaced these old systems with more dynamic cloud-based systems. And so I'm like, wow, we should totally do this for all these cities. We started OpenGov based on that. And at first I was like, let's just like help them do this workflow that we were asking. Let's just call it OpenGov. Let's just ask them to access their data and be able to run models and compare and learn. And a bunch of them were really excited about this. And it turned out none of them had budgets for it. So we were in like 100 cities, but they're paying us almost nothing because they just didn't have budgets for it. And the big unlock for us was realizing, wow, we have to go after the things they're spending a lot of money on, but then hook up these other useful things on top of those as well. And then they'll buy us instead of the existing one.
Got it. And I guess circling back to your old point, which is that no new budget is created for anything. So you really need to be tackling budget that exists.
It's possible to create budget over a long period of time, but you'll be dead before you do it, right? So you have to find some other budget to access in the meantime, and then sure, teach them the new things, to create new best practices. It is possible over time to create best practices, to create some budgets, but it takes a long time. So you better have something else you're selling into first that they're already spending money on.
For sure. And I think one of the things you said earlier was, you said you get attacked a lot already.
Well, I have my own opinions. I don't like to just say what you're supposed to say, so that causes problems these days.
Yeah, and I think that kind of like falls into your thesis. I remember you saying something about, I think it should be okay to kind of like offend people in conversation.
I think being offended is really good for you. Whenever I'm offended, and I stop and I say, okay, why is that really bothering me? Like, what is it that I just learned? What is it that I don't want to confront? Like, it's like whenever you're really angry, you kind of know it's because it's something that's like about you. And then it's the same thing about being offended. It can still be offensive and wrong what they said, but then it's like why couldn't I move up a level of my consciousness so that doesn't even offend me? I'm just, I fully understand where they're coming from, and I'm sad that that's where they are, but I'm not offended by it because I've transcended that, right? So I just think being offended makes you think, and it makes you stronger. And I think this idea of like giving power to someone because they're offended, or making them like somehow you have to be really sorry or really avoid offending them. Like, I realize I have to avoid offending people these days because I want to be able to do business. Right. But I just think it's ridiculous. I think it's good for you to be offended. I think especially in colleges, like you should be offended all the time because you get stronger from that. You get wiser from that. This idea of not offending anyone is lame.
Where do you think that inflection point happened? Like, did you feel that at Stanford? Did you feel like that culture you're talking about right now?
It wasn't nearly this extreme. I think social media had something to do with it. There's like, I mean, I can go on and on about like Richard Dawkins' woke mind virus that Elon talks about too much recently, but it's where that came from and et cetera. But I think there are some really bad ideas about how the world works and about how everything is about zero-sum power struggles and I think whatever you're gonna do about like our understanding of history that gives us our shared society and how it reflects on today, I think it's like clearly the fact that we've ended up with something that where your goal is not to offend people. It's just, to me, it's just really silly and pathetic and misses the whole point about how our society should work.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess coming back into technologies a little bit and kind of like the businesses that you're focusing on, I think the latter part of my last question was, if you were to kind of like start a new business today in defense or government, which you might be, I don't know.
I am constantly starting new businesses.
Exactly. So maybe one of the businesses you aren't starting, what kind of areas would you be looking into?
So we have a build program at 8VC, and we start about 6, 7, 8 businesses a year, and I have 60 people at my firm, and it's a big part of what we do. And then we'll invest about a quarter of our money goes towards building stuff, 3/4 goes towards investing. But oftentimes we'll be looking to build something, and then we'll find people who are amazing, who are already looking at it, and we'll just invest in them instead because it's way easier, building things. And when we build something, we'll partner with usually 2 or 3 co-founders, and so we're a co-founder, but we're a minority part of these businesses. So I'm looking at a lot in defense right now. Something you started. I co-founded with this amazing woman named Malika, is in the regulatory tech space, which I think there's just a lot of interesting things to fix there. I think if you look at, there's 9 million words of regulation per state right now.
This is Esper, right?
Yeah, and there's just so much to do there. So I can go on and on, but there's basically no tech running our regulatory state. This is not a left or a right thing. I think if you're on the left or you're on the right, you want regulatory state to be dynamic, to learn about what's working, to compare itself to other states, to improve itself over time, to get rid of the stuff and there could be regulations that are causing more harm to workers, that are causing job destruction without helping health or whatever. Anyway, so it's obviously should we have data, we don't. So I think that's a super cool area. There's probably more to do in regulation. In defense, there's just a ton of stuff where we waste a ton of money. We're looking at 3 or 4 new defense companies right now. I probably shouldn't give away all of my co-founders areas, but I mean, I think there's a bunch of new things there that are worthwhile. What else in government? I just think there's anywhere you go really deep on a process the government runs, you'll end up scratching it, and you'll find that oftentimes it's broken, and this is why there's tons to do in GovTech, because it's what isn't there to do in GovTech? Tell me something government's doing extremely well that's perfect. It's really great that we don't need to fix. Maybe there's a few of those,
sure.
Right? But I just think almost for me, entrepreneurship is a process of saying where are the gaps in the world, and then figuring out how to fill those gaps, how to see what's broken and go fix it. And so this is why government's hard to build in, but it's a very target-rich environment, because there's just lots of places in government where they haven't had the incentives to get things right, and therefore things have decayed, and therefore there's stuff to go fix.
Got it. And I think hopefully this kind of conversation and the ones that follow inspire a lot of people to kind of start looking into these areas more. But I guess more of a meta question for you. For founders or people in general with backgrounds in SaaS or consumer that don't necessarily come from defense and government, I guess any of those backgrounds, how should they think about building and fundraising in these areas? And I guess the add-on to that is that anecdotally, if you look at companies like Anduril, Palantir, Epirus, and even OpenGov, right? They all kind of have these high net worth individuals kind of on that leadership.
Yeah, that's been the thing that Peter Thiel pointed out that Palmer and I kind of mentioned as well, is that it's kind of sad. Pretty much almost every new multi-billion-dollar defense company had a billionaire tied to it,
right?
In the last couple of decades, and it's partially because these things take a long time. They're really hard, and there haven't been very many big wins, and therefore it's pretty hard to get a lot of VCs to give enough money to it. So, I mean, I probably shouldn't put it this way in public, but in a lot of ways, like Stefan and I had to convince Peter to be our co-founder in order to succeed, right? Because Peter's great, we learned a lot from him, but he wasn't running the company. We were running the company, we were building the company. But if we hadn't had someone like him with his backing, who's willing to keep backing us, it would have been very, very hard, because Palantir took a while to get off the ground. And my friend and I both played that role for Epirus. Palmer, and in some ways Peter with Founders Fund, but Palmer played that role for Anduril.
Right.
And I mean, so the obvious advice is first of all, find something really compelling. It's a big gap. It's really inspiring. It's going to inspire people, and then go find a billionaire and inspire him to be your co-founder. I mean, I'm serious. That's what I would do. That's what I did. I don't know. It's obnoxious, but it's probably true, right? It's find something that's so compelling you can convince really high net worth people to be super inspired by it and help you with it. And that's part of how our system works. And fortunately, our system has there's I don't know, there's a few thousand billionaires, and so I don't know. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to find a small group of people who are high net worth individuals. They don't have to be billionaires, but who are really inspired and want to help you. Another way of doing it is to find something inspiring enough that multiple funds want to get involved too. But I mean, that's the sort of thing,
But I guess there's there's the New American Frontier, there's Cat Boyle's kind of American Dynamism, and I guess your point of view is to find billionaires or high net worth individuals.
Well, I don't think that's how the system should work. I mean, you're asking me. I'm being a realist here.
Sure.
If I was in charge of the system, I'd completely redo the DoD. I'd love to be Secretary of Defense, like Packard got to do in the early 70s, and just come in and just completely change how it worked. I'd force way more open competition. I'd get rid of a bunch of the spend that they do, which is crony, or which is really a jobs program. You're not supposed to say that in DC, but everyone knows, just like the left has some really extreme forms of welfare, the right and the left too have some extreme forms of defense welfare, where you're keeping afloat towns in cities that have nothing to do with fighting China or Iran, but we're just paying for people to work there, which is fine. Maybe that's a good thing, but it's welfare, So we should be honest about what in defense is welfare, what's crony, and what are the actual things that are key. And the actual things that are key, we should be very public about. We should have open competitions a lot more on them, and make it easier to get revenue for companies earlier on in these things versus these long cycles. So, and there's ways we can fix it for sure, and I would love to fix it. But the way it works right now, realistically, is you're going to need a lot more money to break into these areas. And so if you are a founder who does not have access to a lot of capital or to high net worth individuals, it is a lot harder to build in an area like this. That's just the nature of it, right? I think your job as an entrepreneur is you have to be like a realist hacker of the world, right? You say, how does the world actually work, and what's possible? And so not only you have to find things where there's a gap you're going to fix, but the much harder part is like, what's realistic that I can fix with my resources and the people I can inspire. And it turns out if you're like super inspirational person and you found a really big gap, you probably do anything because you can just get enough people on board, you could do it. But this is a harder one. And so you're going to need more unfair advantages you create for yourself to build in these areas, is my experience.
Fair enough. No, that's actually a great segue. And I think you mentioned your build program. Remind me, did AVC started in 2016? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, so we started my predecessor fund in like 2011, and then most of the funds spun out from Formation to become AVC in beginning of 2016. So I've been kind of investing building for a little over a decade.
And why did you pursue this more kind of like incubation bias strategy?
Well, it's almost more like why did I pursue being a VC, which I kind of fell into by mistake because I'm an entrepreneur. So we co-founded Palantir. Addepar, after I left Palantir, we started, which is a very successful company. It's a leading wealth management technology company and has like $4 trillion in the platform. And then I started OpenGov kind of by mistake that I told you because I was trying to do a nonprofit. And then all these people who used to work for me at Palantir were starting companies, and I was kind of just giving them money and helping them and partnering. And I helped start Zambado, which is this thing. So I was just starting all these things and helping people who used to work for me. And because I was helping some people who used to work for me, I talked to my mentors like, Joe, you're basically already running a fund. You just don't have enough money or enough people helping you. So I kind of structured that officially, but I kept helping build things. We started Affinity, which is used by 3,000 venture funds, I guess, 9 years ago. And the act of starting Affinity with one of my chief of staff, he's now one of our partners. He and a couple guys who helped on our team became so much better investors from having experience building something. And I realized I had this thesis that I think almost all the best venture investors have started large companies, right? So like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Reid Hoffman, Vinod Khosla, so the list goes on, like, or have helped build large companies. And I think if you haven't done that, you probably shouldn't be a venture investor, is my obnoxious take on it. You can go work at a venture firm, you can help out, you can be very helpful, but to be like the senior venture investor, you should have first gone and built something. And so this is kind of a cool way I could have people in my firm who are super talented be part of building things as well, and I get to keep building things. And that I think it makes them better investors. I think it gives us networks of things to do. So I actually think in venture, building and investing are very similar and they're very complementary.
Got it. And do you think this like framing, or I guess like the way 8VC it's not a traditional venture firm in that sense, right? Since you are like incubating so many companies.
We're building, but we do have people mostly focused on investing and helping companies. I mean, it's a big firm, so we have a lot of people who have all sorts of different roles for how you help companies, how you mentor, how you help them scale. We really spend a lot of time on things once we lead a Series A, or an early A, or late A, or a B, which is, we stopped doing Bs for a few years because the crazy hedge funds were outbidding us by 2x. That was a whole nother conversation. But as you guys know, I mean, maybe that'll stop right now. We'll see. But when we do a lead, it's like my job, my team's job to make sure that thing wins. And so I spend a lot of my time. I'm here in San Francisco for 3 days. I'm seeing like 14 CEOs. We're strategizing on how to help them. We have people we're hiring to do things for them. So that's your job as a venture firm. Right. But I actually think that because I'm helping build companies still myself, I think there's things I know that I wouldn't have known if I was just giving you advice for having built Palantir in 2004. Like, the whole talent game is completely different, as you know. There's all these things that have just changed a lot. And so I think a lot of these people who built companies 10, 20 years ago, you're kind of out of date. I think you actually have to be building companies now to be able to be a sense of partner to the entrepreneur who knows what they're dealing with.
Got it. And do you think there's maybe a bit of a loaded question, but do you think like in areas of like government defense, like do you think the companies like Epirus, OpenGov, and Palantir, do you think they've been significantly more successful because they have been incubated as opposed to invested in?
Well, Palantir was just like a crazy thing you weren't supposed to do, and we had to hit our head against a brick wall for years, and we finally kind of figured it out and made it work. And because Palantir did that, it kind of created a path for SpaceX, frankly, I think.
Sure.
And because SpaceX did that, it created a path for now Anduril and Empress and others. And so Epirus, so we started Epirus 4.5 years ago with a friend of mine from Stanford and a couple other people who are very talented. And the basic idea is it's the best electromagnetic pulse weapon in the world. And we figured out you can use machine learning on chips, which is fast enough to talk to sensors in an electronic warfare system to make the power all hit the gallium nitride at once. Gallium nitride is a very efficient emitter of electromagnetic energy. So it turns out rather than all the power sort of hitting at different times within 100 nanoseconds, it all hits within 10 nanoseconds. And that means the thing fires almost an order of magnitude better. And when you fire microwave radiation, it doesn't hurt people at all, but it fries electronics at a distance, which is pretty fun, right? So I actually like this one a lot because I don't even have to kill anyone. I can just turn off the bad guys, right? You can turn off ships, cars, tanks, trucks, drones. You shoot down drones like a mile or two away. We just figured out I'm not supposed to talk about this, but you just figured out, it's fine. And I didn't tell me not to. You can put it on a drone and fly it over a convoy, and you can fire hundreds of times, and you can turn off basically no tank or truck or car in that convoy will ever be able to work again until you replace its chips, which is crazy, right? So just for a really cheap cost, you can go and just turn off the invader.
But it won't actually affect the drone you're flying it off of, or
no, this thing fires in a cone out of out of a phased array. The same technology Starlink works on, but used differently. But anyway, it's super cool, and we realized that this is not rocket science, but it turns out you actually have to hire 20 or 30 really good electronic warfare people to build these phased arrays and emitters and stuff correctly. I have no freaking idea how to do that. I'm a computer scientist. These guys have been doing these things for decades, and then you have to hire people from Silicon Valley to do the really fast, or New York, I guess, in finance, do the really fast chips these days, and they have to make them work together. So this is kind of combining skills from two different worlds, and it's not rocket science, but no one was able to do this in the DoD yet at all. So we're way ahead of them. We just did a contest where all the generals are not supposed to, but they were applauding because they're so excited because they're 8 times better than the guys who spent billions of dollars on this. And so we're gonna, so anyway, that's going really well. And I think even that contest that we were allowed to be in, and the fact that they're being taken seriously would not have happened 20 years ago. So we would have just been these weird outsiders that wouldn't even talk to or taken seriously. So there's this understanding that stuff can come from outside of the primes and be really good now. And frankly, even some of the primes are willing to work with us because they know, for example, this technology, because they're concentrating power on very short time scales, you can make radar work 80% better. So the new fighter jets, and so one of the primes managing that radar system, they want to work with us now, which is pretty cool. So you are seeing cultural change where it's a lot easier than it was in the past to kind of get into these places.
Got it. And Joe has a fantastic episode of The American Optimist where he interviews Bo, right?
Yeah, Bo Morris, CTO of Epirus. He's awesome.
And they talk about Epirus, so if this is interesting, you guys should definitely check it out.
If you want to hear about cool electromagnetic pulse weapons, you can go check out Bo.
Shifting gears a little bit, I think we touched upon all the companies you've kind of been a part of so far, but shifting gears outside of founding and investing companies, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Cicero Institute and the University of Austin.
Oh, cool.
Both, I think, missions that are not traditionally, I think, what founders are focusing on, but you've kind of taken an interest in.
It's a different type of kind of entrepreneurship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I guess my questions are, one, why are you focusing on these two efforts, and how does that, maybe you have a grant plan that these lead into? And the second question is, how do we kind of take this or bring this culture of experimentation that we see in startups into industries where that doesn't necessarily happen? And I think Cicero and University of Austin.
You need incentives and accountability to bring it in, right? I think that's key. So, when we look at problems in the world and we say there's a big gap here, regardless of our different backgrounds and views, we can see here's how this is working, here's how it's working now. We all can agree that the homelessness situation, whatever we think the right answer is not ideal, right? There's lots of gaps we can all see in the world that you can have a majority of people agree on. And when I see these gaps, a lot of them will come up with ideas for businesses to build, or we'll come up with new innovative businesses to make things better. Not every problem in the world can be solved by a for-profit business, right?
Okay.
I think more of them can than people understand, but not every problem can be. So you need some other frameworks. And I think philanthropy is one good framework, but a lot of problems that I see in the world, I see them existing because there's a gap in how policy has set up incentives and how policy has set up whatever we're doing. And so my framework for our civilization about what works really well is you want ideas to be able to compete, and you want good ideas to win over time and bad ideas to lose. And accidentally, lots of things we've set up in our country and our civilization, there's not a mechanism for ideas to compete and have creative destruction of bad ideas. One kind of conceptual example is prisons, and everyone's gonna right away go to for-profit or nonprofit. Take that out of your mind for a second. Just prisons in general, pretend they're all nonprofit. There's ways to run prisons. There's programs where people are much more likely to come out and get a job, and they're much less likely to come back to prison. And there's ways where they're much more likely to commit a crime again and go back right again. And so obviously you'd want to have the better ways running and not the worst ways. So the question is, how do you put that mechanism in there? How do you compete, right? Mm-hmm. Same for probation and parole. So right now there's no accountability for probation officers or parole officers. There's no goals. There's no metrics. And turns out a couple states actually did put in metrics and goals for the probation officers, and it hugely raised the rehabilitation rates, hugely, just by putting in some really basic metrics where you measured it and you gave incentives. And it's the same, which makes sense, right? And so one of my other favorite ideas in our society is like vocational school is something I think is really important. Not everyone should go to a 4-year, college. A lot of people should go to vocational schools. You can make 150K for various types of vocations without, totally different skill sets. And so government sponsors a lot of these. It turns out a lot of these that we sponsor are really bad schools. And so people will go there, they'll drop out, they'll be angry, they'll hate our system, they'll come out with very low salaries. So what we did in Texas is we put an incentive in. We said, okay, we're only going to fund these vocational schools the government's funding based on the average salary for 3 years coming out. And so all of a sudden the schools are like, oh, well, I guess we have to figure out what skills we're going to teach to get a high salary. So we're going to have to partner with businesses. We're going to actually have to work on this. Otherwise our funding is going to go down. And so what happened over 7 years is the average salary coming out of all of these schools went up 117%. Wow. And it was just as of last year. So so this is a law that Cicero has now taken, and I've put it in like 9 other states. And some of these schools really don't like it, by the way, because they don't want to have to focus on things to help the students. But for me, a vocational school is about getting people a good vocation. And you should have some kind of accountability. When you put accountability in, it's huge. So Cicero is about like, how do you create policy frameworks that change things at a system level to inspire people to innovate and to fix these broken areas of our society. I think one of the good ways of looking at it is like a good politician will like create a good program in that prison and make it work better and help. But a great leader, a great politician, hopefully, who becomes a statesman, I guess statesman is a better word than politician, will actually fix the system itself that will inspire more people to be leaders. So a great leader creates more leaders. And so how do you create the system to enable people to want to be a leader where their ideas can win?
Hence Cicero, I guess, right?
Cicero was a really great statesman who he had a lot of inspirational views I like going back. I don't think our civilization is perfect, but I think there's a lot of wisdom we've lost by not teaching the classics anymore as kids. And I think Cicero has, in particular, he's famous for like summing up a lot of ancient classical wisdom in the texts he wrote. So I think you can learn a lot from reading him. Yeah, great statesman.
Definitely. And I guess, what is your involvement? I guess working at places like the University or building things like the University of Austin or the Cicero Institute are vastly different, I would assume, from building like the technology companies that you're maybe.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, people are people, right? So yeah. So I'll admit, like I've just recently had someone transitioning out of Cicero, where they're only going to work with us part time now, and it was like crazy. We had 21 wins this year. We're like top in the country for what we're doing at the state level. And this is very personal. I'm not going to talk this way, but it's like, and I was shocked because it's never happened to me before. I'm building a company, and you're like this, and someone like partially wants to transition, and I'm realizing, well, there's no equity.
Right.
And incentives are really powerful. And like, even if I could just pay him a ridiculous amount, but he's actually able to make even more because we've had so many wins together by only being part time with me, and then like selling that to other people now what we've done, which is fine, and I get it. And that's just so you have to remember, like in a nonprofit, there's different incentives, and it's a lot harder in my experience to keep talent. I think I've been able to keep a really good core because they're so inspired by what they're doing. But even then, equity is just I think I underestimate how powerful tool equity is. They're not all there because they like me,
Right.
As much as I might tell myself that, it's actually not, It's like maybe we get along, but the fact that they have $30 million of equity in this thing going to 100 million when we're going to win in the next 4 years is really powerful.
Yep. And
so I think we forget how much equity matters. And so it is a lot harder building Cicero and UATX for that. At the same time, at least right now, the UATX is off to a great start. We're creating a new university. We've raised like $110 million. Looks like we have land east of Austin. We had this really inspirational seminar with a bunch of students earlier this summer, and we're starting to ramp it up, and hopefully we'll have undergraduate class in a couple of years. And I think there's a real need for a university that actually teaches people to think for themselves and to debate some of these ideas. And we can go on and on about the Enlightenment, about what's happened in our universities. And I don't want to have that debate right now, but I'm really inspired by it. I have some great co-founders there, and there's many things that are similar, but yeah, the incentives piece is a hard one.
I asked a bunch of people what like Joe's really good at like kind of talking at, and one of the things that everyone said was basically culture building. You're very good at kind of like building these like mission-driven cultures.
I don't know if I'm good at explaining it, but I do spend a lot of time on that. So you want to know how to build a mission-driven culture?
So I guess all the companies I think you've built kind of, especially in kind of like the areas of defense and government, actually like kind of need to have a really mission-driven culture for people to buy in, right? Because these are kind of like long-term bets. So I'm curious, like, what kind of tact have you taken to like get people excited about this and kind of keep that as you scale?
Yeah, again, this is one of those things it's really hard to fake because you're gonna have to you can't really fake something for years, right?
Right.
And so I think you need founders who are there, who are full-time, who are inspirational, and who really, really care about the mission, and who people can see care about the mission and go out of their way to make it work. And at Palantir, we were lucky to start with a bunch of our friends who were really top computer scientists. So I think we had this advantage where other people wanted to be part of the team because they wanted to get to work with the top talent.
Sure.
And that's obviously a huge thing. But yeah, the whole time early on, we would try to go out of our way not only to be able to make sure everyone knew what the mission was, the vision was, but we try to bring in people to inspire them. Like sometimes we'd have one of my mentors ran MI6 for 30 years. It was number 2 for 30 years, but we ran all the kind of fun parts. And we'd bring them by and have them talk to the team and chat about things. And as we started deploying, we would have people, from the special operations groups and from different SEAL teams who'd been over there, coming in and showing how we were saving lives and showing what else they could do to save more lives and what else we could do to help them get the bad guys. And we call it tours of duty, where we'd actually send engineers to sit with the users. And I've copied that tours of duty in all my other companies as well, where you really want to expose the engineers directly to the customers, directly to the problems. You don't want it to be filtered by your sales guy. You don't want it to be filtered even by the product guy all the time. You really want to have really bright, engaged engineers who care about what they're doing, who are seeing exactly what's going on. And I think if you are working on something that is having that kind of impact, then you're going to have a culture where they're inspired and where they're going to be like, you know what, we're going to stay in this weekend and get this done, because if we can get this out a week earlier, it's going to save more lives over there. So you get that kind of output.
Makes sense. Yeah, I guess seeing the input or seeing the impact you make directly is very intangible, right?
And there's, I think this is a mistake we used to make a long time ago, is the engineers would be in the basement and be told what to do. And I think a core part of Silicon Valley, the reason Silicon Valley outperformed the East Coast in a lot of ways, was the engineers became the first-class citizens who were actually running things starting about 20 years ago. And I think that's core when you're building a company to remember, is you have to have engineers as part of the leadership team, as part of the core culture, directly exposed to problems and working on them. And you can't build a culture otherwise that's quite as strong if they don't have that presence there.
Fair enough. Last question before we get to some rapid fires. You ready?
Yep.
You run a show called The American Optimist. What are you most optimistic for with America and our future?
I mean, I'm generally, I think any problems we're facing in our society today have really good solutions. And I get very frustrated because sometimes we're not pursuing those solutions. But I'm actually very confident that as our generation builds and applies this entrepreneur energy that you guys are all applying to create companies, and if we take some of that and apply it with a sense of duty to our country as well, that energy is going to very easily be able to solve these problems. I think there's just a tiny bit of entrepreneurial energy actually being applied to the problems we're facing. And if we just shift a little bit of this energy, especially once you're successful, spend a little bit more of your time actually saying, okay, here's a problem in our country and I'm going to fix it. I think our generation is going to be able to confront and fix and improve a lot of these things. And whenever I get together like smart friends, even with political differences, there's solutions we come up with together where they're across the aisle. So I don't think America is nearly as broken or nearly as actually polarized as we pretend it is in the press.
Got it. And what, I guess, inverting that question a little more pessimistic, what would lead you to be more pessimistic about the U.S.?
I think one of the most important things, I was reading this book from the 19th century, this theorist, and it was all about Rome and Greece and how they all had a shared agreement, an underlying conception of where their society had come from. And it's there's always these founding myths, and it's something really important for social cohesion to have a sort of alignment on the founding myths and an alignment on what our values and principles and vision is. And when you went back to the 1960s, which is some ways a similar time to today, when things were very polarized and there were a lot of big movements. When you listen to Martin Luther King Jr., he actually called out the founding values of our country and tried to inspire us to live up to what those meant to our country. And he did that very powerfully. And unfortunately today, a lot of people, especially those who have taken over a lot of our university systems, they are actually just extremely negative on the founding values, and they're extremely negative on our history. And I think without a shared foundation, that's somehow a shared positive foundation. Doesn't mean you didn't commit sins, doesn't mean there weren't mistakes, but if you don't have shared positive foundation, it's very hard to move ahead. So I think it's very important to counter some of that, what we're seeing, where they just completely dismiss all of our history as negative. I think it's very unhealthy, and it's very difficult for everyone in society to succeed together in a positive way for the future if we don't have some values that are at the core that we align on.
Got it. Makes sense. Ready for some rapid fire questions?
Mhm.
So the first one is a classic. What is a heretical view that you have that people disagree with you? The classic kind of like Peter Thiel question.
I mean, a
And
lot.
bring your worst.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of those. I mean, I believe that overall the West is a force. Western civilization is a force for good in the world, and that the world would be a lot more miserable and a lot worse off if the Western civilization hadn't become as prominent as it have. And something a lot of people like to hate on in San Francisco.
Yeah.
I'm happy to defend that and argue about that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
If there was one company in the government tech or defense tech space that you could join as a computer scientist, which one would it be? It's like entry level.
I mean, so I think there's like, I'm gonna give two answers. If it's just like, what's the coolest thing to be a part of? It's like this giant thing that's changing everything on the defense side is Anduril.
Okay.
If it's like gonna make the most money while being challenged and learning and a really cool mission, it'd be Epirus for me, because I think Epirus is much smaller now, it's still in Anduril, and has a huge run.
How many employees at Empress? I think Anduril's at like 1,000.
Yeah, I think Epirus is like maybe 150 or something.
Got it. Cool. What figure or figures in history do you derive a lot of your thinking style and values from?
I spent a lot of time when I was younger, especially reading like primary sources from the late 18th century. So I really appreciate a lot of the founders of America, whether it's Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or Hamilton or even George Washington, and then I spent a lot of time reading a lot of like the classical sources as well.
Got it. Cool. If you could tweet one tweet length message back in time to yourself 20 years ago, what would it be?
Go long big tech in 2010. I don't know. I'm not sure. I had to think harder about that one.
Fair enough. What book or books have made the largest impact on you personally?
I always loved science fiction when I was a kid. I think the inspirational science fiction in the 1950s, kind of mid-20th century stuff was really positive, and I love the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. So one of my heroes was Harry Seldon, who basically like uses this what he calls psychohistory to kind of like figure out how to influence the future path of civilization in a positive way. So I've always been inspired, like how can I do things like what I'm doing to actually somehow alter in a positive way the path of our civilization, of our society to dramatically improve it.
Cool. Thank you so much. Can we open up to the audience for a few Q&A questions?
Of course. Thanks.
Any questions, guys?
Talking about how government is sort of insulated from the feedback loop, I think that's sort of the premise here.
Yeah.
Are there any countries that you think government is less insulated, that has more competitive systems and makes better investments?
I think there's some countries that have put certain parts of government into areas where they have to compete and be better, right? So I think there's certain countries where the healthcare systems are more exposed to kind of like efficiency and competition. I think there's certain countries where the different parts of government are measured based on like their impact on GDP, like in Singapore in certain cases, it's quite efficient. China has lots of issues. I think there's certain things in China where they have a lot brighter people running certain parts of the regulatory bodies that are measured in more intelligent ways than what we do right now. So I don't think there's any country overall that's better than America, but I definitely think that there's just like lots and lots of areas to improve there.
Any questions?
So given your earlier work looking at data from municipalities and then recently taking up residence in Austin, you obviously think tech is moving away from San Francisco into other smaller cities. But there's kind of a question as to, of these cities, which one is going to be the winner? We've heard Austin, we've heard Miami. What do you see as the distinguishing features for what could be the big tech cities of the 2030s and 2040s?
Sure. So I would describe it more as that the technology world is becoming more distributed than it was before. And so of the 10 people who are partners in APC, 5 of them are still here in Silicon Valley. I don't think Silicon Valley is going away. Actually, I'm quite optimistic on some of the recent changes I've seen where they just fired all of Chase's people. Apologies if anyone disagrees with me on that. But I do think it's the numbers and the data from what I've seen is pretty clear that it's spreading out everywhere. And what I found is I was actually having to make trips all over the U.S. quite often in the last 5 years. And so living in Austin, I actually fly shorter distances and do much easier to get places I need to go. And Miami is one of them, and DC and New York and Boston are still one of them. But there's stuff we have in Tennessee. There was something we didn't Iowa. There's something we did in Oklahoma, which I wouldn't have guessed, right? So I just think things are much more spread out than they were before. And I think Austin itself is the top tech city in Texas. It's a really cool energy there. I have a lot of my friends who are big entrepreneurs who've moved there. I think we had about 1,000 employees in 6 of my companies there when I moved there. I think it's gone up a lot the last couple of years. So Austin's definitely a hot center. It's very important. But to me, it's less about a competition than it is about just like I have to be in all these different places. And Austin's a very good base to do that from. And I sort of like the energy of Texas, which is another conversation. But I'm there in Texas to fight for our country. So it's a good place to be.
Cool.
Given, I guess, the geostrategic importance of increasing state capacity in things like defense, do you think it makes sense for countries to then have their own sort of Andurils or of that sort? So imagine India has like 80% of its weapons come from like Russia, which it's trying to sort of move away from. Does it make sense that countries like particular democracies where the state capacity is sort of reduced, they'll have companies coming in which make up like a large part of their defense?
Yes, no, I'm very bullish on India over the next couple of decades, and I'm starting to write more checks there. And you know, one of my favorite books on this topic, which is a little bit of I mean, it was not a perfect book, but it was Eric Schmidt gave it out at a talk at a conference we were at called 2036, I think it is, and it's about a future war where China surprises America by completely outperforming it. And without totally ruining the story, at the end, India comes in and saves the day with much more powerful defense and stops them from both fighting each other. And I think actually it's very healthy for the world, for India, to invest in its own defense and hopefully to stop partnering with the bad guys, because that's not really helpful to us. So I'd love them to partner with multiple players while developing their own industry. And that's something actually I'm talking to some of the leaders over there about even right now. There's some families there I'd love to get to know better as we try to help them with this.
Here, actually, a quick follow-up. Yeah, so yes, just ripping on that. There's this meme out there. You see sometimes that like the U.S. military is totally decayed and it's gone soft and weak, and like China and Russia are like way stronger than we are, and actually maybe we wouldn't even survive a war. Like, what is your take on this?
That's overly pessimistic. I still think we have the strongest military in the world. Even though we waste a lot of the money we spend on it, we don't waste all of it, and we spend like an order of magnitude more than them. And there's still systems that we're way ahead on. There's still lots of stuff we're the best at. The thing is scary is there's certain areas where they've started to pass us, and there's certain areas where we haven't improved in a long time. And you know, I think our special forces are by far the best in the world. I'm just amazed by the quality of the special operations groups, and you do not want to play paintball against those guys. It's really painful. But there's really intense, smart, like best of the best people in a lot of those groups. I don't feel quite the same way about some of like the general parts of different branches of the military. I think some of those have gone soft, focused on things that are more virtue signaling than substance. To me, that's what woke really means. Is when you're focusing on something. And the negative connotation of woke is focusing on virtue signaling versus focusing on substance, and that definitely has happened to like a lot of these weird branches of the military. Definitely has not happened to like the core. So we're still quite good, but we have to turn around how we're spending money on technology and how we're thinking about kind of future weapons, because if we're not doing that, then we could get past. Russia probably had all sorts of problems that are even worse than us. You guys probably saw there's all sorts of kind of funny stories coming out of this. I mean, it's a sad situation, but funny stories coming out of what Russia did to its military. There's multiple cases where one guy stole a bunch of the oil and sold it, thinking they'd have enough anyway, but didn't know another guy also did that, so then they ran out of oil on their supply lines. And there's one of them where the tanks had this cool new technology Russia created, that any kind of small arms fire gets this material like shoots it back really accurately, really effectively at the right height to like kill people firing at it. And this is very expensive material they developed, and they were putting it on all their tanks. And it turned out someone stole the money, and there's just egg cartons on the side of the tanks, and no one knew until they started getting small arms fired and it wasn't working. So I mean, there's like all sorts of like comically bad stuff with the Russian military that hopefully we're ahead of some of that stuff. Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest foreign policy blunder of your life in the United States?
Biggest of my life. That's hard because I've been alive for almost 40 years now. But I mean, I think probably the biggest foreign policy blunder of my life is and I actually think it's more complicated whether or not you go into Iraq or which I agree a lot, probably was a mistake overall. But I think staying in Afghanistan and Iraq for as long as we did was the biggest blunder. I think it's ridiculous to spend $1 trillion with no clear objective, no clear mission. And it's like, it'd be one thing if we were like building really strong allies there and creating civil society and like the fact that we did all of that, and it was just, and then when we left, it was like they hated, like they didn't even have like a coherent military we'd spent all the money on. It was really embarrassing how badly that like 20 years was handled. So it's that the whole nation building occupation thing was just, I would have much rather taken that $1 trillion and like gone into poor communities in the U.S. and built infrastructure and created vocational training and jobs and given out money to people here rather than be over there doing that. I think that was ridiculous.
Outside of defense, which industries do you think are the highest priority for investment for national security?
Well, probably manufacturing is the most important. There's certain types of manufacturing. We've made a lot of, as we see right now, pretty dumb mistakes with offshoring certain types of things. We created a company called Resilience Bio, which we raised a couple $2 billion into a couple years ago, at the beginning of COVID, for cell therapy, gene therapy, and mRNA manufacturing here in our allied countries. And it turned out mRNA, of course, was useful. We scaled that up, and it's kind of an AWS for biomanufacturing. But that was really important to have here. And similarly, there's all sorts of things with energy, with refining, with lithium refining, with all this stuff that we know we need that's a little bit messy. And rather than try to like figure out the environmental regulations to make it possible here, while still keeping it a little bit cleaner, we've made it impossible here, and then we do it in a much messier way than even we would do over in other countries instead, which I think is just like very hypocritical. At the very least, if you're going to put rules in for what's not allowed here, you probably need to have some trade rules as well tied to that. Otherwise, you're just forcing it offshore. And we've offshored a lot of critical capability for sensitive advanced manufacturing. And so I guess that'd be the thing I would focus on next. Semis, of course, is part of that. And we've all talked to the guys doing the CHIPS Act, and hopefully we can get something coherent done there. We'll see.
Two more questions?
Sure, 2 more questions.
Great.
As a follow-up to that, given like policy changes, like even with the Build Act are sort of slow to get enacted, how do you think like is the best way to sort of push forward? Given like it's hard to also compete with China on cost of labor, is the idea to push forward manufacturing or bring back manufacturing in America does it need to be driven by something like AI?
Yeah. So it turns out that manufacturing has gotten much more productive the last 10 years in the U.S. overall. So this is probably not a huge jobs program. It is a jobs program, but it's not nearly as big as politicians think, because things have gotten so much. This is like the one area where you see productivity just off the charts growth the last 10 years. And yeah, machine learning, AI, whatever we want to call it, can make advanced manufacturing very productive. And so I think it's important to bring that back here. It will create some jobs, some positive knock-on effects. But that's the reason we can bring it back, frankly. If it was super job intensive, you're right, we couldn't compete with China and Vietnam. It's not super job intensive in the same way, but I think it's very healthy for the country to have more of it here.
The last question. So you built some big companies, you're also super realistic. So one thing that I thought was really interesting that you said was the smartest people, Lockheed built the best technology we had at the time, right?
Yep.
The best people were there.
Yep.
They left. You had someone that worked for you in Austin who left because he didn't have the equity upside. How do you keep the top people at Anduril, at Palantir, once they hit scale and there isn't that equity upside, when it takes a billionaire to start the company, or maybe not a billionaire, but like the DoD is not going to change anytime in the short term, unlike giving small checks out to small companies. That can be assumed. So how do you keep those best people at the Andurils at the Palantir?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different answers to that. One of them is you build a culture where you're solving hard problems that are interesting, and you're empowering people and giving them a lot of intellectual freedom and ability to be part of figuring out how you're going to do things and what they're going to get to work on within the company. And I think a lot of people, they do like to be somewhere where they're paid very well. They're not necessarily going to make $10 million a year, but they're paid very well, and they're getting to work on important problems, and you're exposing, again, them to the challenges and to who they're helping. So I think you can keep a lot of great people. Palantir has really impressed me with the quality of people who are still there, with the bar the culture has kept. even as like the equity upside can't possibly be quite what it was, when we started it 19 years ago. And same with Anduril. It's just such an inspiring mission. Like to be at Anduril, you get to be exposed to like one of the coolest defense, possibly the coolest defense company in the world, working on this like hardware, software solutions, and you get to work with Iron Man basically, right? So it's like it's interesting for people to get to do that. And so I think in order to keep people at these places, it has to be growing. It does have to have upside where it's growing and it's winning, but it also you have to have other great people there, and you have to be inspired by the mission. And it's all about creating cultures. Frankly, it's really hard. I'm still learning how to do it, but it's it's much easier to start new companies. But I'm still trying to learn how to help the big ones too.
Thanks so much, Joe. We really enjoyed
Thanks,
it.
Bala. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Nice to meet y'all.
As a quick close, thank you all for joining. We have our next New American Frontier talk August 4th, and we're hosting Trey Stevens. Reminder, you should join us.
Trey's way more coherent talking about defense than me because he's been like super into it the last 5 years. He started the Anduril. He's a chairman. He's awesome.
Yeah, so excited to host Trey on August 4th. Reminder to apply to the Founder Fellowship and the Deep Tech Forum. Those are interesting. Applications for Founder Fellowship open tomorrow, and applications for the Deep Tech Forum for SBC members close on Thursday. And yeah, that's all. Thanks so much for joining.